Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Do More podcast. I've just wrapped up a conversation with a gentleman named James Chin. He is a professor of Asian Studies at the University of Tasmania in Australia, and as his title suggests, he looks at the region with a very close and analytical eye, focusing specifically on three countries: Malaysia, Singapore, and the Philippines. My interest in him really began and begins with Malaysia, where, of course, he's a Malaysian of Sarawakian descent, and as he shared with me, I think a lot of people don't realize that Sabah Sarawak were not necessarily willing and knowledgeable entrants to the Federation all those years ago. But the past is the past, and the more important time frame is the future. And in our conversation, James shares with me the factors and the circumstances which will influence Sabah Sarawak's linkages with Malaysia in the years to come. Contrary to public and popular opinion, we cannot and should not take Sabah Sarawak's relationship with Malaysia for granted. The region also is interesting because of Sarawak's proximity to the South China Sea, itself a hotly contested area between the two global superpowers of China and America. For those two reasons, eastern Malaysian states of Sabah Sarawak are hugely important to Malaysia, not only in terms of the domestic politics, but also in the role it will play in the global geopolitics in the future. As always, I hope you do share, like, subscribe to the channel if you can and haven't yet already. And so now, dear viewers, may I present Professor James Chin. Professor James Chin, thank you for doing this. It's a big honor and pleasure for you to talk to me all the way from University of Tasmania in Australia, right? And what I know from you is that you look at politics and economics in all parts of Asia, and you are professor of Asian Studies at the University of Tasmania. We've talked many times in the past, and I think your views on East Malaysia in particular and on Malaysia's politics are quite interesting. I'll pass back to you, James, and tell me and tell the broader world what it is that you look at in your course of work.
So my name is James Chin. I'm professor of Asian Studies at the University of Tasmania. So my research interest is on divided societies, and especially the role played by ethnic relations, ethnicity, and religion in those societies. I'm especially interested, of course, in Malaysia, where I was born and raised, but also other societies that's also divided by race and religion. So other societies such as Fiji, Guyana, and of course, countries closer to Malaysia, places like Philippines and Indonesia and Singapore, where race and religion also plays an important role in their politics.
So we, by the time this recording comes out, James, we would have already celebrated Malaysia Day and Merdeka Day in particular in Malaysia. And yet, despite over 6 decades of independence and union in this country, we appear to be still at a crossroads in terms of race relations and how we look at ourselves as a nation. What do we need to know about Sabah in particular, where you are from, James?
I'm sorry, just a slight correction. I'm from Sarawak.
Sorry.
Yeah, but I know Sabah and Sarawak very well. So I think the best way to understand Malaysia going forward is that we can sort of divide Malaysia into three different groups, three distinct groups. Of course, the biggest group is the Malay polity, Malay stroke Muslim, because constitutionally all Malays are Muslims. So that's the biggest group. They have a very specific vision of what they want Malaysia to be. The second group is, of course, the non-Malays, primarily the Chinese and the Indians. They also have a very specific view of what they want Malaysia to be. And of course, the third vision is actually the people of Sabah and Sarawak. And I think what has changed in the last 10 years is that increasingly people on the peninsula side has come to understand that Sabah and Sarawak is very different, especially in terms of political culture, from the people in the peninsula. So the most obvious one is, of course, we are celebrating Malaysia Day on the 16th of September. Most people don't realize that only came about, just about 10 years ago, when Malaysia Day was declared a holiday by Najib, the former prime minister. Prior to that, I think a lot of people have never heard of Malaysia Day, and most people assume that Malaysia Day is Hari Merdeka on the 31st of August. It's only in the last 10 years after the people of Sabah and Sarawak has started agitating about Malaysia there, then people realized that, Merdeka Day actually consists of two separate dates. 31st of August is actually the date when Malaya became independent from the UK, and 16th of September is when the Federation of Malaysia was created. This was together with Malaya, Singapore, North Borneo or Sabah, and of course Sarawak. So I think the way history is being narrated in Malaysia has changed in the last 10 years. And I think a lot of people understand that Sabah and Sarawak are quite unique in the federal system in Malaysia. And people are learning more and more about Sabah and Sarawak. And I think that's a really, really good thing. Now, you ask me, what do people need to know about Sabah and Sarawak? I think the first step is that people need to understand that the history of Sabah and Sarawak is very, very different from the history in Peninsular Malaysia. So in terms of the history of Peninsular Malaysia, I think it's quite straightforward. Prior to colonization, you had the sultanates there, but in Sabah and Sarawak, there was no such thing as sultanate. Basically, North Borneo was run as a private British company, and Sarawak was under the rule of a private British family called the Brookes. That in itself is actually quite unique in this part of the region. There's no other places in Southeast Asia where a private British family or any private family actually rule and create a kingdom. So these two states, North Borneo and Sarawak, actually come from very, very different historical circumstances. And that's the first key difference. The second key difference is, of course, the demography. So in Peninsular Malaysia, the demography at the time of independence was basically Malays, Chinese, followed by the Indians, while in Sabah, it was basically the indigenous, the biggest group were the Kadazan and the Dusuns. And in Sarawak, the biggest group was actually the Ibans, stroke the Dayaks, Bidayu, Chinese, and what have you. So I think in terms of demography, the big change is that in Peninsular Malaysia, the Malay community was the absolute majority, while in Sabah and Sarawak, it was the indigenous community that was the absolute majority when Malaysia was formed in 1963.
How did I think a lot of people don't ask, how is it that Sabah Sarawak came to be part of Malaysia?
So the easiest way to understand it is that at the end of the Second World War, there was tremendous pressure on the colonial powers to give up the colonies. This was mainly pushed by the Americans to the UN, the decolonization process. But the British themselves realized that they're no longer a world power after the end of the Second World War. So there was a policy that was put in place by the British called the East of Suez policy, where the British were trying to give the colonies, independence or self-rule after Second World War. And the best example of that we saw was the partition of India. But in the case of Southeast Asia, you have to remember this was the Cold War era as well. So when Britain decided to get out of the region, they realized that they control four sort of independent territories in Southeast Asia: North Borneo, Sarawak, Singapore, and Malaya, and of course, they were also in direct control of Brunei as well. The initial plan was to put all these five territories and create a single country. A lot of that, of course, was the fact that they wanted a country that was fairly strong in order to withstand the so-called yellow peril or the communist intervention in Southeast Asia or the spread of communism. But more importantly, I think the British wanted to leave the place rather than a group of small countries which are very vulnerable. They wanted a single federated country where they could retain sort of their influence in the region. So the initial plan was basically to federate all these five countries into a single country. But we know at a very early stage of discussion, Lee Kuan Yew and Tunku Abdul Rahman were really in favor of it. But after the first round of discussion, Brunei decided to pull out. So that's the reason why we're left with the other four territories. But I think there is also a bit of questioning over whether North Borneo and Sarawak were really consulted in the sense that North Borneo and Sarawak at that time were really under British control, and the people there were really sort of not educated enough. The bulk of the population were not educated about this whole idea of creating a new country. So basically, the argument is that they went along with whatever the British wanted, and the British wanted very, very clearly early on. They wanted a federation in Southeast Asia, which is strong enough and pro-British as well.
So, what you're suggesting is that the East Malaysian states really had no influence and really were, in some sense, unwitting partners to Malaya on the peninsula side, right? And this is really at the behest of the British at the time.
Yes, I think what is very important was that there was a very important meeting in Singapore led by the top British official in the region, where it was very made clear to the governors of Sarawak and North Borneo that they are supposed to use the entire administrative machinery to make sure that the people supported this proposal, this grand proposal put forward by Tunku Abdul Rahman. One of the interesting things about this proposal was that the first public announcement was actually made in Singapore, not in Malaya. So Tunku Abdul Rahman gave a very important speech in Singapore where he talked about trying to federate these 5 territories. So the British immediately called in the governors. In those days, the governors were very powerful. They had full executive powers in North Borneo and Sarawak, and they were told to use the administrative machinery to make sure that the people supported this proposal. And that's exactly what happened, because the next stage was that the British government and the Malayan government set up a thing called the Cobalt Commission. The idea behind the Cobalt Commission was that they're supposed to ascertain the wishes of the people of North Borneo and Sarawak, whether they want to join this new federation called the Federation of Malaysia. So the short story is that they went to both North Borneo and Sarawak. They spoke to many people, but you have to remember a lot of the people they spoke to were part of the chartering class that was controlled by the British. Some of the native grouping, they met, basically said that we will go along with whatever the government wanted. And of course, the government at that time was the colonial government. So they produced a report. Basically, the report says that 1/3 of the people they met fully supported this new federation called Malaysia. 1/3 sort of opposed it, wanted independence or continuation of British rule, and 1/3 said that they are willing to help set up this new federation in return for certain safeguards. Safeguards are sort of guarantees that they wanted to build into the system before Malaysia was formed. Now, a lot of people since then, including historians, have argued that maybe the thing was not as kosher because the whole thing was set up in such a way to get a yes answer. The British was desperate for a yes answer. Because you can also argue that the 1/3 who said that they favor Malaysia, if there were safeguards, you can also argue that they are also uncertain about Malaysia. So you can argue that 2/3 of the people were not sure about the federation and only 1/3 were pro-federation.
Well, if I'm to repeat what we know about human nature and the influence of the powerful, it seems that 1/3 even of people who acquiesce to this union might even be a bit generous, James, if I'm to be honest. But be that as it may, at the time, this is like maybe 60, 70 years ago, right? What kind of promises were made to the East Malaysians at the time, or the Borneo states, as it were? What kind of promises were made? What undertakings?
So basically, if you want to see a full list of the undertaking, there's 2 very important documents you should consult. One is the Cobalt report. The other is the Intergovernmental report, IGC report. Both these are available on the web. You just have to Google it. People talk about the 20 points. The 20 points was actually a summary of the points from the Cobalt report. But basically, the people from Sabah and Sarawak, in terms of the safeguards, the most important thing they wanted was they wanted to make sure that they can carry on with religious freedom. That's number one. Secondly, they wanted autonomy in terms of administration because they do realize that it's very different. The political culture, everything was very different in Peninsular Malaysia compared to Sarawak and Sabah. Thirdly, they wanted immigration control, which is they wanted the ability to stop people from outside the state. Now, this immigration control thing is state specific. In other words, the Sabah government can control anybody from coming in, including Sarawakians. Similar to Sarawak, they can control any non-Sarawakians from coming in. On top of that, they wanted certain autonomy in terms of local government. Local government stuff in Peninsular Malaysia does not apply to Sabah and Sarawak. And of course, they want autonomy in other areas, basically dealing with things like certain parts of raising taxes. And one of the interesting things was that Sabah actually wrote into their wish list a 40% rebate in terms of all the revenues raised in Sabah. So it's constitutionally actually written into the new Malaysian constitution that Sabah is supposed to get a 40% rebate on all the revenues raised in Sabah. So those are some of the safeguards that was built in.
Well, in the 60, 70 years since then, how many of these undertakings have been adhered to?
This is an area that is very controversial. I think the easiest way of understanding it is not so much to look at each of the specific items, but to understand that after 1981, Malaysia underwent through a period of what we call strongman politics. So in 1981, Mahathir came in, and Mahathir decided to centralize a lot of the power in the federal government. My take is that Mahathir was a man in a hurry. He really wanted to industrialize Malaysia. He was a man in a hurry, and he really wanted to build the economy, highly ambitious, and he understood that the only way to do this was to centralize many powers in the federal government. So because of that, the federal government increasingly took over a lot of the state powers, not only from Sabah and Sarawak, but also from the Malay states in Peninsular Malaysia. And what happened was that basically whatever things they took over, the Sabah and Sarawak government unfortunately did not really put out a fight or did not remind the federal government that they actually did not have the power. You have to remember, this was the era of strongman politics. It was sort of era of where Barisan Nasional totally dominated the political process in Sabah and Sarawak. So both Sarawak Barisan Nasional and Sabah Barisan Nasional, on paper, they were very strong. They controlled the states. But when it comes to Mahathir and the federal government, they were very, very weak.
At no point in time have you yet mentioned resources, specifically the petroleum resources off the Sarawak coast. What about that issue?
Yes. So most people say that the petroleum thing is actually part of the MA63 agreement. Unfortunately, if you read the MA63 agreement, petroleum is actually not written in. At that time, they were not looking at petroleum resources. I think the petroleum resources thing is part of this overall thing about Sabah and Sarawak being so far behind in Peninsular Malaysia in terms of development. And there's always been unhappiness because Sabah and Sarawak are the main oil and gas producers. So there's always this suspicion that, all the money made by Petronas, all the dividends paid by Petronas throughout the last 40 years, most of it actually came from Sabah and Sarawak in terms of the oil and gas, but the money has not been spent on developing Sabah and Sarawak. What happened is that the joke in Sabah and Sarawak is that Mahathir used the money basically to build the Petronas Tower, and one of the towers is paid by Sarawak, the other tower is paid by Sabah Oil and Gas. If you look at in terms of the iconic projects in Malaysia during Mahathir's time, you can make a very strong argument that he has really neglected Sabah and Sarawak, because you talk about Mahathir's iconic project, you talk about Putrajaya, you talk about North-South Highway, all these things are built in Peninsular Malaysia. In fact, the Borneo Highway project only started less than 5 years ago. So you can see it's very clear that, despite Sabah and Sarawak supplying the bulk of Petronas wealth throughout the last 40, 50 years, right, Sabah and Sarawak has really not benefited. And in fact, Sabah has consistently been one of the top states in Malaysia with very high levels of poverty. Even in Sarawak, if you go back during Mahathir's time, it's always been a state with quite a high level of poverty, especially in the rural areas.
James, can you describe your home state of Sarawak? What is it like? It's massive by way of land size, sparsely urbanized. Most of it is jungle and rural. Can you describe what it's like in Sarawak?
Sure. So the way to understand Sabah and Sarawak is that in terms of geographical area, Sabah and Sarawak are physically bigger than Malaya. But in terms of population, of course, it's very small. The combined population of Sabah and Sarawak is probably just over 6 million. So they're very small in terms of size compared to the whole Federation of Malaysia. Perhaps the best way of understanding it is that if you were to drive from Kuching nowadays to drive to Kota Kinabalu, right, it will take you roughly 2 days to get from one end to the other end. Even with the Borneo Highway, it will still take you overnight. So this is how big the state is. Uh, Basically, what has happened in the last 40 or 50 years is that increasingly the rural area has been depopulated because a lot of young people, for all sorts of reasons, have moved to the urban areas. So the rate of urbanization in Sabah and Sarawak is quite fast, similar to Peninsular Malaysia. In fact, in Peninsular Malaysia, more than 80% of the population actually lives in the urban areas now. You just look at Klang Valley. Klang Valley is basically, in the old days, Klang Valley was Kuala Lumpur. Now Klang Valley stretches, you can almost say argument that goes all the way down to Malacca. So, people are just moving towards the urban area. And the same phenomenon is happening in Sabah and Sarawak with depopulation. But having said that, because of the large land mass, Sabah and Sarawak, you have centers, urban centers. So in Sarawak, the three major urban centers is basically Kuching, Sibu, smaller in Bintulu, and Miri with the Brunei border. Once you cross over the Sabah, it's basically Kota Kinabalu and Sandakan. So these are the major urban corridors in Sabah and Sarawak.
When I go to either KK or even Kuching, it feels like a different world. In fact, until recently, I had to bring my passport there, which seemed weird because we are part of the same country. But there seems to be, because I'm asked to bring my passport, there seems to be some distrust of peninsular rights. And I think my limit to stay in Sabah Sarawak is like 3 months, or is it 1 month? I can't remember. And so it seems like a different world. And the racial composition seems different. The language spoken seems different. I think mostly English, and of course a lot of native tongues. Talk to no, talk to me about the people, James. What is the feeling on the ground? Are they happy? Are they sad? Are they optimistic? Are they pessimistic? What are they like on the ground, James?
So in Sabah, as I mentioned, the majority in the old days was the Kadazan Dusuns. But in Sabah, you had a very specific problem called the PTI problem, or the illegal migrants, from mostly from the southern Philippines, from the Moro region. So that population in Sabah now is actually more than half. Some people argue that they're about 50, 51% of the population. So it is quite incredible that, during the strongman rule of Mahathir, he has managed to change the population of Sabah. So now the foreigners, what they call foreigners in Sabah, has overtaken the local indigenous. So that is Sabah in itself. And you're right, the environment in both Sabah and Sarawak is much, much more multiracial. So, for example, people from Peninsula who has never visited Sabah and Sarawak, when they arrive there, the first thing they always tell me is that when they look at a certain person, they're not sure whether the person is Malay, Chinese, or Indian, because now people look, for lack of a better word, mixed. In Sarawak, the majority, we don't have the PTI problem in Sarawak, but the majority of the population there are the Ibans. Then you got the other native groupings like the Bidayus, the Malay, Malanaus, and then the other important group is of course the Chinese. The Chinese in Sarawak constitute just about 20% of the population. So in Sabah and Sarawak is very, very plural. The other thing is that the Muslim population in Sarawak is about 25%. So the Muslims are the only minority in Sarawak. But in Sabah, due to the PTI, the Muslims are now the majority. But before the PTI, it was a Muslim minority state as well. So the big difference between Sabah and Sarawak is really the PTI issue. But in general, it is a very plural society where everyone understands that nobody really has a majority, no ethnic group has a majority. But in Sabah, you now have a Muslim majority state. So that's the reason why people like myself are saying that one of the problems we face in Sabah is that increasingly Sabah politics may mirror those of Peninsular Malaysia. So prior to that, politics in Sabah and Sarawak has always been very plural because no ethnic group had a majority. People always understand that you always had to form some sort of coalition across the different ethnic groups. So today you can argue that in terms of Sabah and Sarawak, you can sort of divide it into three groups. So in Peninsular Malaysia, it's sort of a Malay, Indian, and Chinese. In Sabah and Sarawak, you sort of divide the three groups as Muslim Bumiputera, non-Muslim Bumiputera, and the Chinese. So that's the easiest way of understanding what is happening over there.
Have they been happy with the union?
I think what has happened in the last 10 to 15 years due to social media, there is a lot of awareness about the Malaysia Agreement, and a lot of these historical grievances have floated to the surface. So the argument I made is that in Sabah and Sarawak, you have the rise of state nationalism. Many of the younger people and the older people are unhappy. The older people remember the sort of promises that was made by Tunku Abdul Rahman in terms of creating the federation. And the younger people are really angry because the more they learn about the history, the more they realize that they've gotten sort of a raw deal out of the federation of Malaysia. So I would say that there is a significant portion of people. I'm talking about the natives, not the newly arrived in Sabah and the natives of Sarawak. I think increasingly they're becoming unhappy with the Federation of Malaysia. And I think a lot of it has been fueled by the regime change, the first regime change in 2018. They're seeing that Malaysia has taken a sharp turn to the right. So they're very worried about the sort of toxic politics we see in Peninsular Malaysia. And they're very worried about the future of Malaysia with this sort of toxic politics happening in Putrajaya and Peninsular Malaysia generally.
Sabah Sarawak used to be known as the vote bank for UMNO in past elections, thanks in large part to the strongman Chief Minister of Sarawak, Tan Sri Taib. Okay. Well, he's gone now, and you've got a new regime. How important now are the East Malaysian states of Sabah Sarawak to the ruling coalition?
I think the way to understand it is that you really cannot have a stable federal government if you do not have support from Sabah and Sarawak. So Sabah and Sarawak have about 57 seats all up. So they constitute about 25% of all the seats in parliament. So without that bloc supporting you, I think your government will not be stable. So for example, UNOA claims about 150 members. So without the Sabah Sarawak bloc, the government will almost certainly fall. The big difference between Sabah and Sarawak is that Sarawak's bloc is very solid because it's under a coalition called GPS, which is basically the old Sarawak Barisan Nasional. In Sabah, it's more complicated because the GRSS is sort of in an indirect competition with Barisan Nasional, although they're part of the same government at the federal level. But by and large, on key issues like MA63, all the MPs from Sabah and Sarawak do come together and support this sort of renegotiation or making sure that the promises made in 63 are kept by the federal government.
You have written about the next elections in your research and writings. I see that you have postulated three different scenarios for the next elections. Can you go through those three options and those three permutations, James? And tell me what you think is the most likely outcome.
Okay, so I think in terms of the next general election, basically, I think the first scenario is what a lot of non-Malay population in Malaysia wants, which is a continuation of a so-called unity government. That in itself is also highly controversial because I think increasingly, if the election is held in the next 12 to 18 months, I doubt very much that Barisan Nasional and Pakatan will come together with a single logo. They'll still go in a separate logo. So it will very much be sort of a post-election coalition government. That is one scenario. Anwar will win again, and he can undertake major reforms, because the argument being made now is that he is now turning to the right in order to capture the Malay vote, and therefore a lot of the real reforms he wants to do, he's sort of holding it back until he wins elections. People don't realize that a lot of people have forgotten that Anwar was not elected the last round. He was basically selected by the palace to lead a new coalition government, the so-called unity government. So he's never won the election on his own. So that's the first scenario. The second scenario is, of course, the opposite, that Perikatan will make a big comeback. But I suspect if they were to win next round, it is not because of people like Bersatu, it's really the resurgence of PAS. PAS in the last election, 2022, the big news about PAS was that not only are they the biggest bloc in parliament, but more importantly, for the very first time since Malaysia was formed in 63, PAS has broken out of the so-called four northern Malay states. Their influence is broken out of four northern Malay states. They even won in places like Penang, Anwar's PP seat. So, so it is quite remarkable that PAS has been able to do that. And in the recent Terengganu state election, the Perikatan won 100% of the seats in the Dewan Undangan Negeri. So PAS has really, has really sort of surged in Peninsular Malaysia politics. So that's the second scenario. The third scenario is really that the same scenario that we see now, which is that both sides are split equally. The Malay vote is split three ways, and that Sabah and Sarawak will end up as the kingmakers again, who will have to decide which side will form the government. So I think, in many ways, you can argue that we're back to square one. Sabah and Sarawak increasingly will have to go their own way. And in Peninsular Malaysia, it's all about searching for Malay political stability, about who really speaks for the Malay community. Is it from the Anwar side or from the PAS side?
Which is the most possible option, do you think, James, at this point in time?
I think all the rules that we understand about Malaysian politics out the window. But what we do know from research done in the last few years is that the young people are really, really attracted to PAS. So I've been making the argument that, sometimes it's quite dangerous if you want to make fundamental changes to the system. As you all remember, right, from around 2016, 2017 onwards, there was a big push by the NGO community in Peninsular Malaysia to lower the voting age. At that time, of course, they didn't say openly, but the underlying assumption was that young people were more progressive, they tend to be more anti-government, and they will vote for more progressive party. And in fact, that didn't happen. If you look at the voting trends in 2022, young people actually voted mostly for conservative Malay politics, especially PAS. So I think that was a huge mistake on the part of the NGO community. Even today, those people behind the big push, they refused to admit that it was a mistake on their part, and they're still pushing for electoral reforms. But this sort of thing is actually quite dangerous. You have to think carefully about the sort of reforms you want to do. Sometimes the reforms may not lead to the outcome that you want.
There's a school of thought that the young people voted the way they did not because they were more conservative, it was more of a rejection of the established order. What do you think about that?
I would say yes, there's an element of truth in it. But I would say that the bigger truth is that in the last 15 to 20 years, the growth of the religious school, both government supported and a private religious school, have really taken over. One of the things I find really interesting in Peninsular Malaysia, in the urban areas, that you go to every suburb, every housing estate, you find the Islamic tadika there. So even if you go to a normal Sekolah Menengah government school, increasingly it's becoming more Islamic. Therefore, the entire Muslim community, not just the Malay community, the Muslim community is becoming more conservative, combined with past mastery of TikTok videos, right? Pushing for conservatism. They have really won the game when it comes to electoral politics. For whatever reasons, which is still not very clear, Pakatan Harapan is horrible when it comes to social media. especially with TikTok. I would have thought they would have done something about it, but they did not, which is really, really surprising. The reason why it's surprising was people like myself were talking to them, and we were telling them, well, I was telling them, you just have to look at the example early on in the Philippines before the Malaysian general election. Who would have thought that Bongbong Marcos, the son of a dictator, wants the largest presidential margin of victory in the Philippines presidential election. And you can speak to any Filipino, they will tell you that it's largely due to TikTok. TikTok managed to wash away the family's political history, totally rewrote the part when his father was a dictator, to plunder the Filipino economy and all that. And the past did exactly the same thing in 2022, and they did the same thing in 2023. In both elections, we saw that Pakatan Harapan was really way behind in terms of social media. So it is quite interesting that the Islamic Party, you have thought that they will reject technology, so on and so forth. I know the joke in the Chinese community is that they want to go back to the first century. In fact, they are far, far ahead compared to Pakatan Harapan.
Well, it's not just social media, what James. It's other things as well. A lot of people in the business world here as well in KL say that the current government hasn't done much by way of policy because his hands are tied, lah, essentially, right? So why do you think Pakatan is in such a mess?
No, you were asking me about the voting pattern. I was just explaining that.
But the fact that Pakatan doesn't handle social media as well as they should, nor do they handle policy frameworks as well as they should, comes with a much more fundamental set of reasons, right? What are those reasons?
But the social media part, I would argue, can be resolved easily if you get the right people to run your stuff. It can actually be reversed. But in terms of the economy, that's the larger picture. I think if you speak to the Pakatan people, they will say that they understand there are lots of problems in the Malaysian economy, in Malaysian society, but they say that it's very difficult for them to move ahead because one of the unspoken rules of Malaysian politics is that you do not have legitimacy if you don't have the majority of the Malay votes. So with this Pakatan Harapan government, it doesn't matter how you count it. At most, they have about 35% maximum of the Malay party votes. So the majority of the Malay votes is still with Perikatan. So unless UNHAPPiness can claw back the Malay votes and get the so-called legitimacy among the Malay community, some of the key policies he may want to pursue may not be available to him. So that is how I would explain it. So that's the reason why maybe he's a bit slow, because he doesn't want to rattle the tree too much. He's trying to move to the right in order to recapture the Malay vote. So that's the reason why earlier I mentioned that a lot of people are telling me that, yes, he is a reformer, but most of it is on hold until the second term. And some people said that this is exactly what happened to the DAP government.
Correct, but you don't have the time. And if you don't have the mandate in the first by way of the support, what makes you think you can get a second term?
Well, that's a really, really good question. You can ask them, but they seem to believe that there is no way around this except to win the Malay vote first before we can do anything. This is what they believe in.
So they're going to turn conservative, swing to the right, and then swing back to the center if and when they win the elections. Is that the game plan?
Uh, well, roughly the game plan, but in the meantime, whatever reforms they can do, they will do it. So in the areas where it is not controversial, like some areas of the economy where they can change, they will change. But in the really, really big picture stuff, they can't change without the support of the Malay community. That is the bottom line. This is what the Malay establishment believes, that you do not have legitimacy unless you have the Malay vote. This is something that is very, very strongly felt among the political establishment, especially the Malay political establishment.
So, in your read, what does it take to win the Malay vote for Anwar?
So Anwar, if you look at his actions so far, he has sort of swing to the right, taking out the Palestinian cause, holding the Bermuda Economic Congress, increasing benefits for the civil service and all that sort of stuff. So he's doing all those things to benefit the Malay community, hoping they can get back some of the votes. My take is slightly different. I believe that if he competes with PAS on the religious thing, he will lose. He should know better than that, because in the 1980s, he and Mahathir started this Islamization of the bureaucracy or university values. And that actually helped to strengthen PAS. Rather than beating PAS, they actually lost out the PAS. So he has already gone up one big round against PAS on the religious thing, and he lost. The reason why he cannot win against PAS on the religious issue is very simple, because PAS idea of a religious issue is very simple. We just want Negara Islam. From day one, we just want to set up Malaysia as Islamic State. That thing, I don't think Anwar can deliver Islamic State. So there's no way he can out-Islam PAS. My argument is that the way to win the Malay vote is actually through the economy. If you get the economy right, the Malay community as a whole feel that they're better off in economic terms, better job prospect. They can see a future for their children. They got more money in their pocket. That is when they're willing to support a Pakatan government, because they think the Pakatan government can deliver on a better life for them. But if you play the religious card, you're absolutely right. I don't think that he can beat PAS on the religious path. In fact, I will argue that the more he turns to the right, that will simply push PAS even further to the right, and actually will strengthen PAS in the long run.
PAS is really the single largest component party in parliament, with something like 40 plus seats, right?
Yes.
What are the chances of them gaining more ground in the next elections, and then, in some sense, forcibly pushing through the idea of an Islamic State? If that happens as well, taken to its next level, what does that mean for Malaysia? What does it look like?
Right. So if you sort of take the 6 state elections, the one that was held, the 6 state elections, if you sort of take that winning margin and you said that let's use that formula and put it to the next general election, PAS will win in the region about 70 seats. This means that PAS will be in the lead to put together a coalition. Of course, we know the magic number is around 112 to 115. So together with Bersatu and maybe 1 or 2 other parties, they may be very, very close to that halfway mark and be able to form the government. PAS will not push for full Islamic State if they are not in control. When I say they're not in control, I mean when they don't hold the prime minister seat and they are not the dominant party. So they will not be able to make Malaysia into a full Islamic state, change the constitution, if they don't become the dominant figure in the government. As long as Bersatu is there, they will not be able to do it. But over the long run, if PAS becomes stronger and stronger, so for example, if they cross the 100-seat threshold, then yes, they will try to negotiate with the Conference of Rulers and sort of insert or change the wording of the constitution. So right now, the constitution is written in sort of a very ambiguous way. Rather than saying that Islam is the official religion, it just said that Islam is the religion of the federation, while other faiths are free to practice. I suspect they will change that sentence to make it very clear that Islam is the official state religion. So you have to remember they have several models to follow on. The simplest model they can follow is what happened to Pakistan. Pakistan, as you know, used to be a British colony as well. When Zia al-Haq took over, he simply changed the preamble of the Pakistani constitution to say that, our guiding light is Islam and the Quran. So they can do that as well, if ultimately if they're in charge of the country.
Political expediency is not the same as social cohesion, shall I say. And because of this turn towards conservatism in the last few decades by, as you say, Anwar and Mahathir, James, this is not going to sit well with the Sarawakians or the Sabahans, which, as you say, are historically are quite, quite diverse, lah. How does East Malaysia, how do the Borneo states position themselves in the context of this development, as you say, unfolding?
So the way to understand it is that the political elites in Sabah and Sarawak are sort of very mercenary. They want to get as much autonomy as possible, and they want to extract as much concession as possible from the federal government. So they're quite happy to join whoever will give them what they want. So when I say that, people are always very surprised. They say that, does this mean they're willing to work with PAS? I would argue that in the next state election, if they are really the kingmakers, if they can really tip the scales, the answer is yes. They're even willing to go along with past as long as past can deliver what they want. So basically, what they want is almost what we might regard as state within a state approach. So you can see Sarawak is in the process of setting up their own airline. It's already started their own set of international schools. They've got universities. They're trying to sort of build a state within a state. Sabah, if GRS sort of dominates the next state election that's also coming up, they've made it very clear that they want to follow the Sarawak model. So basically, in both Sabah and Sarawak, they want to retain their very unique political culture. They want to build a high fence, and they're willing to negotiate with whoever controls Putrajaya to say that, can you give us all the concessions we want? So basically, for Sabah and Sarawak, it's about who can deliver them the maximum autonomy and the maximum funds to build up both states. To me, that is the bottom line.
Some weeks ago, I spoke to Rita Sim and Fui Kay Song. I think you may have listened to them speak as well. And they suggested that there could be new factions forming within ASEAN in Malaysia, and specifically Singapore, Johor, and Sarawak. Sarawak and Johor have something that the Singaporeans crave, which is landmass. And Sarawak in particular has something that Singapore needs badly, resources. What do you think of that school of thought?
I think that is, yes, I've heard people talk about it, but I won't take it too seriously for the simple reasons that Sarawak has already signed some agreements with the Singapore government. For example, there's an MOU on supplying energy to Sarawak, but I don't think that triangle between Singapore, Johor, and Sarawak will work because Johor and Sarawak are very, very different. I think it is more of a bilateral thing, Singapore, Johor, Singapore, Sarawak, rather than the triangle, Singapore, Johor, and Sarawak.
One of its capital that Sarawak needs. I don't think you can get any richer than Singapore, can you?
No, this is why I say it's more of a bilateral thing. Uh, I think the Singaporeans are actively looking in Sarawak on many projects. One, of course, is carbon sinking, but they're also looking at another one that will really sort of fundamentally change Singapore-Sarawak ties. Is, of course, if Sarawak uh, and Singapore can come up with the technology to transfer power from Sarawak to Singapore. I think that will also fundamentally change the nature of Singapore-Sarawak relationship.
I heard quite facetiously, but much more profound than it sounds, that Sarawak to Singapore was like a woman who was like a man craving another person's wife, even though that other person is still in a marriage. But that other person can't wait to get out of that marriage to be remarried for a second time with that new suitor. Would that more accurately paint the
That
picture?
that is probably too complicated for me to understand to talk about marriages. It's not in my area of expertise. But put it this way, lah. People don't. History is really instructive, right? People don't realize that before Malaysia was formed, Sarawak had very very deep relations with Singapore. In fact, Singapore was the main trading partner for Sarawak for many many years, all the time from the time of the Brooks to the time when Sarawak helped form the Malaysian Federation. So the links have always been there. So even today, right, you look at all the top trading families in Sarawak, Chinese trading families, a branch of their family usually lives in Singapore. So Singapore has always been entrepot. It's always had very, very deep links with the Sarawak Chinese business community. Because as you know, right, in the old days, if you ship anything to Kuching, it has to go to Singapore first. So there's always been that very long and deep historical links.
Of course, you've got the whole issue of the South China Sea, and well, there are two main parties at play there, which is the Americans and the Chinese. The Americans, I think, so the story goes, helped Pakatan win the last election through funding and I think their spoiler tactics lah. Now, how would you read that particular theme? And everybody knows that the Chinese and the Americans are at loggerheads lah. The Americans have a zero sum game tactic where they want to stay as number one, and they don't appear to believe in a multipolar world, right? Whereas, of course, the multipolar world is exactly where we're headed to. So how do you think that larger macro, global picture shapes out, especially with the South China Sea, which is of course on the banks of Sarawak?
Yes, in fact, most Malaysians do not realize that when they talk about Chinese ship incursion, right, they actually most of the incursion actually occur off the coast of Bintulu in a place called James Show. But I think the bigger issue is that if you were to speak to people who work on the conflicts, they will tell you that in terms of Asia, right, the two top spots in terms of potential conflicts opening up is North Korea and the South China Sea. So it is quite clear, even in the last few weeks, we had very close military encounters between the Filipino Navy and the Chinese Navy. And recently, the so-called breaking news that the Chinese government actually sent an official note to the Malaysian Foreign Ministry asking them to stop doing oil exploration and drilling in some parts of the South China Sea. And that is being claimed by China. I don't think I'm revealing a secret here to say that the Americans have been pushing Malaysia to take a hard line towards China. Not only recently, for many, many years. Even 10 years ago, the Americans were telling the Malaysian government that we can supply you with photographic evidence and other evidence to show that the Chinese ships has been entering Malaysian waters. For a very long time, there's been a lot of close encounters between the Sarawak fishermen and the Chinese Navy. But all this is not reported in Malaysian papers for the very simple reason that the Malaysian government do not want to confront China openly. So the Malaysian position is that basically we can live with both superpowers. We do not want to confront them. We want to build up trade. We want to lock our ties, and our ties are so close that it's very difficult for them to maneuver over the long run. But what the Malaysians don't understand is that Malaysia occupies a special place in the way the Chinese see Southeast Asia. So if you look at the map of Southeast Asia, right, especially the so-called nine dash line, the country that is most affected by the nine dash line is actually Malaysia, because Malaysia is the only country that straddles both sides of the South China Sea, right? No other country can claim that. So a lot of people think that from the Beijing side, Singapore is the most important country. I'll argue that is not true. For geostrategic reasons, it's actually Malaysia. So even when you talk about high-speed train, right, the most difficult part to build is actually the so-called train that leaves Singapore that goes all the way up to Bangkok. That is the part that is the real game changer. Because countries like Laos and Vietnam and all those countries that link to Kunming, right, they will quite happily fall into China's hands anytime. It's actually Malaysia that plays a crucial role. So the question you asked me is that how do Malaysia sees China? I think for Malaysians in general, they see China as a rising power. They see America as a declining power. But among the political and economic elites in Malaysia, they see China a bit differently. They see China as opportunities, economic opportunities. But for the Malay elites, they see China also as a threat. I think there's always a significant portion of the Malay establishment who are very suspicious of the Chinese political elites in Malaysia. The suspicion is that with the rise of China, the Malaysian Chinese political elites may use the rise of China as a leverage against the Malay political elites or the Malay political establishment. There's always that sort of a questioning the loyalty of the Malaysian Chinese. But what the Malay political establishment do not understand is that the Chinese Malaysians actually have very, very little common in terms of thinking with the Chinese in China. The Chinese in China, the way they look at the world is very different from the way the Malaysian Chinese look at the world. So although ethnically both sides are Chinese, right, their thinkings are completely different. It's just like, an American-born Chinese, his thinking is completely different from Malaysian-born Chinese. Both are ethnic Chinese, but the way they look at the world, the outlook is completely different.
Well,
So
it's,
I think,
well,
sorry?
James, the thing is, the people don't really matter in this equation because it is the political elites buttering
Yes,
with
yes,
another set of political elites. Right,
yes,
so you might think differently, but what is at play here are resources and economic
yes.
ties, right? Do the Malay political elite have any credence or room or legs to stand on where this concern is? Because one can easily surmise that these discussions might be taking place. Malaysia is critical to China in the region.
Yes, so the Malay political elite see the rise of China as both an economic opportunity and a threat. Right now, those who see China as an economic opportunity are the majority among the Malay establishment. But of course, there's a small group who has always seen the Chinese Malaysians as the boogeyman. They're playing up the fact that if China becomes too strong, then this will strengthen politically and indirectly the Malaysian Chinese. The point I was trying to make just now about the different outlook was that it is not true. And it's also not true that the Chinese in China are interested in helping the Malaysian Chinese politically. They actually see the Malaysian Chinese as foreigners. They don't actually regard the Malaysian Chinese as their own. They will say a lot of things about how we share the same language, culture, or that sort of thing. But when it comes to the crunch, they see Malaysian Chinese as Malaysians, not as Chinese.
As a reality check for people who are doing business in the country, as well as for people who are just normal people with jobs and families to run, businesses, little and their careers, right? How do we position for this future where you've got all these many forces at play, many of them conflicting, and the permutations are so vast, and the conclusions, the how they roll out is still so uncertain. How does one position?
So the short answer is you can't position yourself, but I would argue that the Malaysian Chinese are in a very good spot now. Two things are happening in the Malaysian Chinese community in the last 50 years. One is that the community has become much smaller. Part of it is because they're not having as many children as the previous generation. They go for quality. Secondly, the bulk of the Chinese community now in Malaysia are actually outside the government education system. So what you find is that in every Chinese middle class family, you will find that often more than one children are actually cari makan outside Malaysia. They're either working in Singapore or in China, Hong Kong, Australia, or in other parts of the world. So the Chinese Malaysia are actually in a very good position to benefit from the rise of China. The issue is whether the Malay establishment recognize, the sort of talent there is in the Malaysian Chinese community and willing to give them the space to operate in Malaysia. Because if they are willing to give them the space to operate in Malaysia, a lot of these overseas Malaysian Chinese are actually willing to bring back their skills and capital back to Malaysia. At the present moment, because of the toxic politics, right, a lot of these people will not come back. So that's the reason why there was such a huge euphoria feeling in 2018. Immediately after the fall of the Barisan National Government, people were talking about the coming back of the non-Bermudas coming back into Malaysia. Some of them did come back, but those that I know have all left Malaysia again because they just could not operate. They found that there was really no fundamental change. So this really requires a fundamental change in the thinking about among the Malay political establishment about how they see the non-Malays in Malaysia as a group, rather than about the rise of China. It's more to do with domestic politics than with the rise of China.
So you've got the luxury of looking at Malaysia from some distance away because you're based in Tasmania, which gives you, I guess, a more clear and lucid eye and a more neutral point of view, James. What is your read of the developments of the last, say, 1-2 years in terms of shaping how we should think about Malaysia in the next 1 to 2 years?
So I think the conclusion for the last 2 years is two things. One is that in the non-Malay population or non-Malay voters, there is a sense of disappointment in Anwar. They supported Anwar so strongly. They thought he's going to bring real reforms, especially in terms of ethnic relations and in part Islamization. He has done nothing but it's sort of gone the other way. That's one thing. Secondly, I think the entire country as a whole has suffered from COVID. People don't realize how badly the Malaysian economy was damaged by COVID and that Malaysia did not recover fast enough. So in some ways, you can argue that the last 2 years has been a period of disappointment. For the non-Malays, it's mostly in the political arena. For the entire Malaysian public, it's the fact that they'll see that their living standards have gone down. You can speak to most of the really good economists. They'll tell you that the old formula of T20, M20, B40, sorry, M20, M40 and B40 has now changed to T20, M20, and B60. So the sort of middle class, a portion of it has actually dropped to the bottom. So unless we get the economic thing right, I doubt very much that that Malaysia can move ahead. But whatever it is, over the long term, Malaysia must really grapple with one issue, which is what do you do about the Bumiputera policy? Because the rest of the world is moving ahead very fast. I mean, 15 or 20 years ago, if you or I were having this conversation, I would say that Malaysia was in a very good place to overtake a lot of other ASEAN countries. But today, you can see easily Vietnam and Indonesia has already overtaken us, and we are still stuck in a rut. And the basic problem is this issue of the Malay political establishment refuse to change the rules of the game. They think that the rules they put in after the racial riots in 1969, they think that formula they put in still works. What they don't realize is that the entire society has changed. People have moved on, but they're still hanging on to the old formula. And the old formula simply does not work in the 21st century. That's the bottom line.
Well, you talked about how the Anwar government cannot out-Islamicize past because they just don't have the credentials. The only way to win that faction is through the economy. But if the economy is crippled by these policies, then he's stuck in a catch-22. So that means the
Yes.
possible outcomes are not the best in the world.
No, like I said, I'm not suggesting a solution. I'm just telling you as it is.
Correct.
A lot
Correct.
of his people believe that he cannot do much without the Malay vote. And once he gets the Malay vote, there's also a question mark about how much he can do.
When you went to Tasmania, James, how did you end up in Tasmania? And I think more germanely, how did the Australians look at Malaysia?
I'll answer the second question first. So Australia has always had very good relations with Malaysia. They've always seen Malaysia with very tinted glasses for a very simple reason that even prior to the formation of Malaysia, they always had very close links because you're part of the British colonial system. Tunku Abdul Rahman and Lee Kuan Yew were very well known among the political elites in Australia. But more importantly, Malaysia is part of the Five Powers Defence Pact. So for a very long time, even today, there are Australian Air Force people in Penang. And also, there are thousands and thousands of Malaysian who study in Australia. So Australia has always seen Malaysia as a very stable country in Southeast Asia, a country that they know very well, and a country that they really, really support. So I don't see any problems with Malaysia, Australia. How did I end up in Australia? A very simple reason. I was headhunted to come to the University of Tasmania to set up a thing called the Asia Institute. So that's how I ended up in Australia. Like many Malaysians, sometimes we are offered a job overseas, and if the job offer is reasonable and good, we take it.
So what other countries do you look at other than Malaysia?
So I look at other countries that I follow very closely are the Philippines and Singapore and Brunei in Southeast Asia. And I also study the South Pacific. I keep a very close eye on Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, and Fiji.
The only country which seems, I guess, material at this point in time is Singapore and the Philippines. What do we need to know about those two countries?
For Malaysians, the most important thing about Singapore is not how well the economy is doing. We have to stop harping on the fact that a lot of non-Malay Malaysians said that Singapore did the right thing by breaking away. That's why they're so successful. The real reason Singapore is very successful is due for historical reasons because the West really supported Lee Kuan Yew. But in the later part, Singapore's success is because they're very rational and they're very transactional in the way they do things. For example, they purposely set up Singapore to be the financial capital of Southeast Asia or that sort of. So they're very strategic and they're very rational about the way they approach. They don't take into account things like race and all the other things that we always take into account in Malaysia. In the case of the Philippines, what Malaysians need to know is that the Filipinos are very, very ambitious. They want to get the act together. But Philippines is not like Thailand and it's not like Vietnam. It is much harder to get the act together because the country is much more plural and diverse. So the northern part of the Philippines is very, very different from the middle part of Philippines and the southern Philippines. So Philippines, in some ways, is closer in terms of the way the system works, closer to Indonesia than compared to Thailand and then Vietnam.
Singapore seems to be going through some kind of existential crisis as well. They are questioning their place in the region, and they have a little bit of a leadership vacuum now that the Lee family dynasty seems to be ebbing away. Would that be a fair surmise conclusion, James?
No, I would argue that the system put by the Lee family is still working remarkably well. Singapore is one of the few countries around the world. You can sort of project the leadership well in advance. Their transition is a no surprise transition. So everybody knew that Lawrence Wong will be the next prime minister. So there is a no surprise transition. I think the system put in by Lee Kuan Yew is still working remarkably well. I think the question for Singapore is really whether they can reinvent themselves. They're very good at reinventing themselves in a high-cost economy, and that's the reason why this the Sing dollar is so strong. I don't think Singapore will sort of decline in the coming years. In fact, I'll argue that it'll become much stronger because they're doing, like I said, doing all the right things and sort of projecting forward. I think the bigger problem they face is the same problem they faced back in the 70s for Singapore at its first technical stage, which is the rest of the region is not as stable as they hope them to be. Because one of the problems with Singapore is that if the rest of the region is not stable, it will affect them immediately. Because as President Habibie from Indonesia reminded us, Singapore is just a red dot. But he forgot to add that it's a red dot where all the money is stashed.
Which country is the most unstable in the region in Singapore's eyes?
There's no country that is the size of Singapore. But if you were to ask me which is the most unstable country in ASEAN now, obviously the answer is Myanmar. As long as they don't get it together, I think that part of the world will remain very unstable. People forget, right? The recent riots happened next door in Bangladesh. So it's quite interesting that if you live to this is the what they call the thing that Singaporeans understand. If your neighbor is unstable, right, you are going to be unstable. You'll be catching the virus sooner or later.
Well, you know what, right? Some days ago, I was listening to Kishore Mahbubani of Singapore, right? And he said that he remains always quite surprised that Southeast Asia, ASEAN, hasn't had more wars lah, because we're so different. You compare Europe, which has had multiple wars. In fact, there's one going on right now, and they are not as different as we are, right? He largely credits ASEAN and the formation of ASEAN. Do you, for that piece lah, do you agree with him?
I will only agree with him to a certain extent. Yes, ASEAN play a crucial role, especially during the Cambodian crisis. That's because the 5 original ASEAN members, the leaders, had all shared similar outlook about the region. But since ASEAN had the 10 members, I think you got 2-tier membership. The original members, where the political elite still think the same way, and the newer members like Cambodia, Vietnam, they think in a different way. So I think there's a bit of tension in ASEAN. And this tension can be seen in the way the Chinese are sort of influencing ASEAN. They're very close to people like the Cambodians, and Myanmar and all that sort of thing. So you can see there's a clear split between the original ASEAN and the newer members of ASEAN. Yes, ASEAN plays a crucial role in Asian stability, but increasingly, right, they're losing the narrative of ASEAN centrality because ASEAN has not been able to resolve this South China Sea thing for the last 20 years. Part of it has got to do with the fact that Beijing refused to engage ASEAN. They want to engage bilaterally only the countries where they have an overlapping claim. But more importantly, I think the reason is because of what I said earlier between the 5 old countries and the 5 newer countries ASEAN. And don't forget, right, in the next 2 or 3 years, definitely in the next 5 years, ASEAN will have a new member, which is East Timor. And that will again change the dynamics a little bit.
James, I gotta ask you before we part ways, at least for now. How do you think it all plays out? Do you have children? How do you guide them? How do you advise them? What things do you tell them?
Really, the world has changed so much that you can't really guide them. The most important thing is that you give them all the good principles of life and all the good values of life. And that is the only way you can guide them. It's not like in the old days, 30 or 40 years ago, people said that, if you want to play it safe, you study accountancy or you study law. Nowadays, right, everything has changed. One of the big changes that's going to sweep through the legal fraternity in Malaysia is that, for example, in the West, right, a lot of the legal work is now done by robots, especially things like when you buy a property, right? The thing is actually drafted up by AI. You just have to give them the details of the property. The AI will draft the thing, and you only have to double check that all the key items are there. So, things like the legal profession, all these are being swept away by AI. And this is where I worry about Malaysia. If Anwar wants to change one thing, right, outside economy, outside religion, right, if he really wants to bring Malaysia to the next level, he has to look at the education system, because our education system is one big, big problem. Basic problem is being politicized. Secondly, right, the people running our education system are actually not interested in education. They're interested in something else. And if Anwar cannot resolve the education system, I think we will be heading for very, very turbulent times in the future. And this will have direct consequences for ethnic relations in Malaysia, because as I said earlier, the bulk of the non-Malay population, especially in Peninsular Malaysia, are already moving their children to the private education sphere.
Three key principles you share with your children, James. I don't know. I'm not sure whether you have categorized them as conveniently as that. But if I were to put you on the spot and ask you what are the three top principles, the three key guiding lights that you share with your children, if and when they get old enough, or already maybe they're old enough, what would they be? For not just for survival, but for success in the future.
I haven't really thought about it, but right now, right, at this moment, if you would ask me, what would I tell my children are the most three important things in life? The first one is that learning is really a lifelong process. Never think that you know everything. There was always somebody who knows more than you. It's better to learn than to say that this is the only way. Secondly, I would tell them that there's no substitute for values, good values in life. And the third thing is that never forget where you come from. I think these are three very important things. As we head towards the next century, I think increasingly identity is becoming more and more important to individuals.
I hope next time we can talk in person, James. I've only ever spoken to you either on the airwaves or on the internet. So hopefully one day we get to meet and share a coffee. Thank you so much for doing this. Huge honor, huge pleasure. Thank you so much, James. Take care. Take care of
Thank
yourself.
you. Bye bye.